While most kitchens serve food, one nearly served death. Clara Bennett, a young pastry chef with a painful past, thought she had escaped her demons, until a quiet scent of almonds pulled her back into a nightmare. At a Mafia banquet where power is plated with silver, she halts a poisoned dessert moments before it reaches a 10-year-old boy, the heir to an empire. Accused, watched, alone. But what happens when the boy begins to trust her more than his own blood? What follows is not just a mystery, but a transformation of loyalty, silence, and love where no one expected it. Stay with us to the end, because this story proves sometimes the most dangerous ingredient is the truth. Clara Bennett steadied her breathing as she slid the last ramekin onto the polished silver tray. Hours of work had led to this moment. Every swirl of chocolate, every perfect rise of the soufflés meant to cement her reputation in the Morelli kitchen. She had rehearsed it all, even how she would stand, how she would hold the tray with quiet confidence when the sous chefs whispered behind her back. But as she leaned closer, the familiar scent rose up, faint, almost coy, but lethal to anyone who knew what to smell for. Bitter almonds. For a heartbeat, she thought she was imagining it, some phantom of her past, trailing her into this new life. Then, as she inhaled again, the certainty slammed into her chest. It wasn't a mistake. Her throat constricted. No, she whispered to herself, backing one step away from the tray. She saw her brother's face in her mind, David, 16, convulsing on the kitchen floor back in New Orleans after the tainted almond extract. The doctors had said he'd been seconds from death. The scent was burned into her memory, as real as fire. She blinked hard, her hands trembling but still steady, her body moving before her mind had caught up. She turned sharply toward the nearest prep station, where Victor D'Angelo was still wiping down his counter. "Victor!" she hissed, her voice low. "Who handled these?" He didn't look up, only muttered, "Everyone's been in and out, Bennett. Ask someone else." She didn't have time to argue. A server reached for the tray, balancing it expertly as he prepared to glide into the banquet hall where Donovan Morelli sat at the head of the table. Clara stepped forward, blocking his path. "Wait," she said, more forcefully this time. The server frowned. "It's going out now. Orders." She could see Leo Morelli's small silhouette through the open door, seated stiffly at his father's right hand, like a miniature prince at a dangerous court. Her stomach lurched. "No," she said, her voice cracking but rising. "Not yet." She caught the tray with both hands before the server could protest. "It's not ready," she snapped, and her words were louder than she intended. Heads turned. The sous chefs froze. The air itself seemed to contract around her. For a moment, no one moved. The server's mouth opened, then shut again as if gauging the price of defying a Morelli chef mid-service. Victor's eyes flicked up at her, unreadable, but a small, almost imperceptible smirk curved his lips. "What's your problem, Bennett?" he drawled. "Lost your nerve?" Clara's knuckles whitened on the tray. She ignored him. "Call Marcus," she said to no one in particular. "Now." She turned back to the soufflés, forcing herself to focus on the details. Her nose wasn't lying. The faint, acrid sweetness curled up again, a ghost of poison hiding under cocoa. She dipped a spoon lightly into one ramekin and touched it to her tongue. Just enough to taste, not enough to harm. Her stomach tightened instantly. It wasn't almond extract. It was cyanide. Not much, but enough for a child. Her vision blurred for a second, her brother's body on the floor overlaying the image of Leo at the banquet table, his small hands folded neatly on the linen like a boy who knew not to fidget in front of sharks. She swallowed hard and looked up just as the kitchen door swung open. Two security men in dark suits appeared, impassive and heavy-shouldered. Marcus Voss, the head of security, followed a step behind them, his gaze sweeping the kitchen with soldierly precision. "Problem?" he asked, his tone flat, but laced with a warning. Clara lifted the tray slightly. "This can't go out," she said. "It's been tampered with." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "By who?" She shook her head. "I don't know, but it's poison." The room erupted at the word. One of the younger cooks cursed under his breath. Victor snorted and crossed his arms. "That's a hell of an accusation," he said. Marcus took a slow step toward Clara, his eyes narrowing. "You're certain?" She nodded. "I know the smell. I know the taste. This will kill him." Marcus turned to the security men. "Take the tray," he said curtly, but Clara held on. "No," she insisted. "Chain of custody. You have to test it first." The kitchen door banged open again, and Donovan Morelli himself entered, his presence cutting through the noise like a blade. The chatter died instantly. He was taller than she expected up close, his suit dark, his expression carved from something older than stone. He didn't look at the tray. He looked at her. "Explain," he said simply. His voice was quiet, but the weight of it filled the room. Clara's mouth went dry. "There's cyanide in the dessert," she said. "For your son." For a moment she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, fear perhaps or rage, but it was gone before she could be sure. "And you know this how?" he asked. She hesitated. "Because I've seen it before," she said. The words tasted like confession. Around them, the kitchen staff watched in frozen silence, eyes darting from Clara to Donovan as if witnessing a trial. Donovan's gaze moved to Marcus. "Lock it down," he said softly. "Nobody leaves." Gasps rose as the command echoed outward. Security converged, sealing the exits, sweeping the hall. Donovan stepped closer to Clara, his eyes sharp but unreadable. "If you're lying," he said, "you understand what happens." Clara swallowed hard but didn't look away. "I'm not lying," she said. She felt the tremor in her hands but kept her voice steady. He studied her for a long beat, then nodded once to Marcus. Two men stepped forward, surrounding her. Victor's smirk widened. The tray was taken from her grasp. She didn't resist. "You saved my son," Donovan said quietly. "Or you tried to kill him." His voice was even, without accusation or gratitude. "Either way, you'll answer for it." Clara's heart pounded, but she held his gaze. In one night, she had become both savior and suspect, her fragile new life collapsing into the same shadow she had tried to escape. As the guards led her away, she caught one last glimpse of Leo at the banquet table through the open door, his face pale, his eyes fixed on her, a silent question hanging between them. The lock clicked behind her, not loudly, but with finality, like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence she hadn't written. Clara stood in the center of the guest room, arms crossed tightly over her chest, trying to ignore the quiet hum of the surveillance camera tucked into the molding above the fireplace. Her chef's coat had been taken. So had her knives. She wore plain clothes now, and yet she felt more exposed than ever. The walls closed in with a sterile chill, and her mind, left unguarded, turned to the places she didn't want it to go. Hospital rooms flooded with too much white light. Her brother's body jerking, lips pale and eyes wide with confusion. Her own voice, 17 and shrill, begging someone to help, anyone. The courtroom, 2 months later, when she took a plea deal just to keep David from being dragged into it. The way her mother never looked at her the same afterward. Clara clenched her fists. That girl was dead, she told herself. She'd buried her beneath years of sweat, training, and discipline, but right now she felt her breathing in the back of her mind. Not gone, just waiting. She paced for a while, counted the seams in the wallpaper, listened for voices through the door, but heard none. They hadn't arrested her, which was something, but they hadn't cleared her either. She was in limbo. She remembered Marcus's voice in the kitchen, cold, skeptical. "You're sure?" And Donovan's eyes, steel behind the calm. "You understand what happens." She had said yes. She had been sure. But what if she had been wrong? What if the scent had been some kitchen anomaly, a batch of almonds gone rancid? She hadn't waited for the lab. She'd made the call. Clara sank onto the edge of the armchair and dropped her face into her hands. Her chest burned with doubt, but beneath it all was a deeper ache, shame. Not for what she'd done tonight, but for how easily the past still ruled her, how quickly she'd reverted to being the girl no one trusted, the girl who broke things by trying to fix them. That was what stung the most. Not the suspicion in Marcus's eyes or the way Victor had smiled, but the silence that followed. No one had defended her. No one had even tried. Then came the knock, a soft one, almost too light to hear. Clara looked up, surprised. She'd expected Marcus, or worse, Donovan himself coming to deliver a verdict. She crossed the room cautiously and cracked the door, keeping the chain latched. What she saw made her freeze. A boy, barefoot, small, standing perfectly still like something out of place. His dark hair was neatly combed and his hands were behind his back. Leo. Clara stared at him for a second, trying to process the image. He didn't flinch under her gaze, didn't look afraid or curious, just still. "Can I come in?" he asked softly, barely more than a whisper. She hesitated. "You shouldn't be here." He shrugged. "I know, but I wanted to." She looked back down the hallway. Empty, no guards, no staff, only this small boy with the eyes of someone who'd seen too much too young. She unlatched the door and opened it slowly. "Just for a minute," she said. He nodded once and stepped inside. He walked past her like he'd done it before, like he'd memorized the route. He didn't sit, didn't touch anything, just stood in the center of the room and turned to face her. "You didn't look scared," he said. Clara blinked. "What?" "When you grabbed the tray. Everyone else froze. You didn't." She didn't know what to say. She hadn't thought about fear in that moment, just memory and instinct. Leo tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Were you scared?" he asked. She considered lying, brushing it off. But something about him, his blunt honesty, the quiet focus in his expression, made her answer differently. "Yes," she said, "but I couldn't stop to be." He nodded, like that made sense to him. "My dad didn't look scared either," he added. "But he was. I could tell." Clara sat down on the edge of the armchair again. "He loves you," she said. "He's supposed to be scared." Leo didn't answer that. He looked down at his feet, then back up at her. "They think you did it." It wasn't a question. "Do you?" she asked, her voice quieter than she expected. He met her eyes, solemn. "No, you smelled something. You stopped it. That's not what bad people do." His words landed like a weight on her chest, not heavy in a crushing way, but grounding, like something anchoring her to the present. She hadn't expected this. Not from the Don, not from Marcus. Certainly not from a 10-year-old boy raised among watchmen and wolves. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him he shouldn't trust so easily, that he didn't know her. But the truth was, he did. He'd seen her in a moment when no one else had moved. And maybe that counted for more than anything on a resume or police file. "Thank you," she said, but he only nodded again. "You'll be okay," he said, as if stating a fact, not offering comfort. Then, just as quietly as he had come, he turned toward the door. She followed him, not wanting to draw attention to the visit, and opened it without a word. He slipped back into the hallway, small steps vanishing into the dark. Clara closed the door behind him and leaned against it, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Then the tears came. Slow, silent, unstoppable. Not because she was afraid, not because she was angry, but because, in the middle of all the suspicion, someone had looked at her and seen more than her record, more than her past. Someone had seen her. The hum of the security camera never stopped, even when she was sure no one was watching. Clara had learned to count the seconds between rotations, memorize the blind spots. She wasn't proud of it, but pride had been a luxury long stripped away. Since Donovan's men had loosened her leash just enough for her to return to the kitchen under guard, she'd moved like a ghost between stations, shadowed by distrust in every glance. No one said it out loud, but the looks were sharper than knives. Every sous chef acted like she was radioactive. Victor, especially. He wore his suspicion like a badge of honor, always lingering just close enough to whisper, but far enough to claim distance when things got ugly. And things, Clara felt, were only going to get uglier. It wasn't just the tension in the room. It was the silence where there should have been answers. The investigation felt performative. No one had been arrested. No one had been cleared. She was still the variable, the chaos in the equation. And yet, beneath her exhaustion, a fire had begun to simmer. If they wanted to pin this on her, they would have to erase every trace of the truth. She wouldn't let them. The decision came to her with the weight of inevitability. That night, once the rest of the estate had gone quiet, Clara slipped from her quarters, heart pounding as she moved in practiced silence. She wasn't reckless. She was meticulous. She'd seen where Marcus stored the kitchen keys earlier, in a lockbox on the back wall of the prep corridor. She'd watched the passcode over his shoulder, 5714. A birth date maybe. She didn't care. It worked. Within seconds, she was moving down the cold hallway, barefoot to silence her steps, a flashlight clutched in her hand like a talisman. The walk-in freezer at the end of the hall had always made her uneasy. It was too pristine, too remote, not part of the daily rhythm of the kitchen, but somehow always accessible. She held her breath as she slid the door open, the cold air hitting her like a slap. And there they were. Sitting neatly on the second shelf, arranged with obsessive symmetry, were 6 chocolate soufflés, identical in appearance to the ones she had made for the banquet. Identical down to the sugar dusting and the piping on the edge. But she hadn't made these. Not these. Clara stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. Whoever had crafted this second batch had done it with precision, with knowledge of her technique, her preferences, even the specific ramekins she favored. She crouched down and scanned the tray. These weren't simply backups. They were planted. Her mind raced through the night of the banquet, back to the moment she'd pulled the original tray from the server's hands. Could someone have swapped them out just before service? Was Victor involved? He'd been hovering. But even he wouldn't risk a child's life for a promotion, would he? She hesitated, then reached out and ran her fingers lightly along the rim of the nearest ramekin. Her skin tingled, the cold bit into her fingertips. And then she felt it. A single raised ridge along the silver, a fingerprint. Deliberate. Someone had touched the dish after plating, not with gloves, not by accident. Clara froze, pulse thudding in her ears. It wasn't hers. She'd worn gloves that night. The print was faint, but clear enough to distinguish. A left thumb, pressed in haste or arrogance, she couldn't tell. But it was real, and it didn't belong to her. For a moment, Clara considered running to Marcus right then and there, telling him what she'd found, but she paused. She didn't trust him yet. Not fully. His loyalty was to Donovan, not to justice. If Marcus had already made up his mind about her, this discovery could vanish in a whisper. No, she had to be smart. She had to be precise, just like the person who had framed her. She carefully opened a small freezer bag from the shelf nearby, the kind used to store herbs, and, using a clean spatula, slid the ramekin with the fingerprint inside, sealing it tight. If this came to a confrontation, she would need evidence, real evidence, not intuition, not memory, the kind of evidence that didn't lie. She stood there for another few seconds, staring at the untouched soufflés. It chilled her deeper than the cold. The realization that someone had not only copied her work, but weaponized it. Someone who knew her culinary fingerprint so well they could impersonate it. Someone who had banked on her past, making her too easy to blame. She looked down at the tray again. This wasn't about dessert. This was ego, power, and someone wanted her gone. She retraced her steps with surgical caution, slipping the bag into the false bottom of her prep station's drawer before retreating to her room. She didn't sleep. Instead, she lay awake, thoughts looping through every conversation, every glance, every shift change in the kitchen. Victor was the obvious suspect, but that felt almost too clean, too convenient. Could Sylvia have arranged it? She was powerful, calculating. Clara had caught her watching the kitchen that afternoon, though no one else seemed to notice. And why had Sylvia requested a private tray earlier that day? Clara's stomach churned with unease. There were too many moving pieces, too many ways this could unravel. She needed help, but she didn't know who to trust, except maybe Leo. His visit still lingered in her chest like warmth in a snowstorm. He had seen her, believed her, but he was a child, a target, not an ally. Clara closed her eyes. The image of the untouched soufflés burned into her mind. Someone had taken her name, her craft, and nearly used it to kill a child. She would not let that stand. No matter how carefully they'd covered their tracks, they'd left something behind. And that was enough. Back in the freezer, Clara had lingered one final second before closing the door. And in that moment, the weight of what she'd uncovered truly landed. Not only had someone tried to kill Leo, they'd tried to make it look like she had done it herself. The soufflés weren't just evidence, they were a message. We can be you, we can erase you. Her breath caught in her throat as she remembered running her fingers along the tray's edge, how the ridge of that fingerprint had almost felt like a signature, arrogant, intentional. The ghost of another chef's ego pressed right into the metal. She clenched her jaw trembling not from cold, but from fury. She wasn't going to be erased. Not this time. She had clawed her way out of the dark once, and she would do it again. Clara turned, leaving the freezer behind her, the air biting at her skin. The soufflés remained on the shelf, untouched but damning. They looked perfect, but now she knew they were anything but. Leo's fingers moved with delicate precision, threading the tiny landing gear into the notched plastic belly of the model airplane. He sat on the trimmed grass like it was just another afternoon, unbothered by the fortress of men patrolling the perimeter, by the swirling tension thickening behind closed doors. Clara stood a few steps away, arms crossed, unsure if she was intruding. After everything, the accusations, the surveillance, the uncertain future, she hadn't expected to see him out here, alone, working quietly on something so normal. She didn't want to startle him, didn't want to project whatever mess she carried onto this small moment of peace he had carved out for himself. But then Leo looked up without surprise, as if he'd known she was coming. His expression didn't shift, didn't brighten or darken. He just lifted his hand and gently patted the patch of grass beside him, an invitation without fanfare, without expectation. Clara hesitated only a second longer before walking over and settling down beside him. There were no words between them for a while. Just the soft snap of a wing slotting into place, the rustle of grass. And in that silence, Clara felt something settle in her too. Not calm, but the absence of alarm. The plane was blue, not unlike the one her brother used to fly. She remembered helping him with model glue, holding wings in place while he giggled and asked her questions she could never answer. Why the sky was blue, why airplanes didn't fall, why grown-ups always lied. Here and now, Leo didn't ask silly questions. He worked with a kind of focus that didn't belong on a 10-year-old's face. His hands were steady, his eyes sharp. Finally, he spoke, not looking at her, but at the model. "Did someone try to kill me?" The words were light, almost detached, like he was asking about the weather. Clara's spine straightened. Her instinct was to deflect, to soften it, to shield him. But that moment had passed. He had seen too much, and he deserved honesty. "Yes," she said quietly. No sugarcoating, no protective spin, Leo didn't react the way most children would. He didn't cry or gasp or demand answers. He just nodded once, slowly, like she had confirmed something he already suspected. "Okay," he said, and then he returned to the model, like death was just another part to fit into place. A full minute passed before he spoke again, the words falling like pebbles into water. "Dad won't cry, not even if I die." Clara turned to look at him, but he didn't return the gaze. His voice wasn't bitter or angry, just plain, like it was fact, not accusation. He'd get angry. He'd kill whoever did it, but he wouldn't cry. Clara wanted to say he was wrong, that Donovan would weep, would fall apart. But she didn't know that. Not truly. What she did know was how empty power could feel, how grief in places like this was a luxury, buried under legacy and politics. She swallowed hard. Leo looked up at her finally, his eyes too steady for his age. "But you looked like you would," he said. That hit her harder than anything else could have. The memory of that moment, the tray in her hands, the taste of panic in her throat, and Leo's wide eyes watching her, came back with stunning clarity. She didn't know what he'd seen in her face that night, but clearly it had left a mark. The truth was, yes, she would have cried. The thought of anything happening to him hadn't just scared her, it had broken something open. Clara reached over, slowly, and adjusted the left wing of the model airplane, which had been slanting slightly. "Like this," she murmured. "You want symmetry so it doesn't tip in flight." He watched her fingers, then nodded, accepting the correction without ego. That struck her too. How unspoiled he was, despite everything, raised under the shadow of a man like Donovan Morelli, surrounded by men who killed for silence and women who ruled through venom, and yet here he was, listening, building, trusting. "I'd cry," she said finally, barely above a whisper. Not for dramatic effect, not because she owed him comfort, but because it was true. She would cry if he died. Not because she knew him deeply, not yet, but because he was still good, still trying, still real. And that was worth mourning, that was worth protecting. Leo didn't smile right away. He looked down at the model again, and then up at her, a flicker of something crossing his face, maybe trust, maybe relief, maybe something even simpler, recognition. And then, without warning, he smiled. A small, crooked, quiet smile, not the kind plastered on for guests or trained by handlers. A real one. Clara felt it like sunlight, sudden and warm. It was the first she'd seen from him, the first real expression that wasn't buried beneath duty or silence. She smiled back, though hers trembled slightly. It wasn't just what he'd said, it was what he hadn't. The way he hadn't asked for protection, hadn't asked her to promise anything. Just her presence, just the truth. The grass around them swayed, and the moment felt suspended, like a still frame in a film they both knew would keep rolling. But for now, this frame mattered. "What's the plane's name?" she asked. He shrugged. "Don't know yet." Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of chocolate she'd hidden earlier, a habit from years of anxiety. She handed it to him. "Name it after something sweet," she said. Leo looked at the chocolate, then at her. "Maybe I will," he replied. They didn't speak after that. But they didn't need to. For the first time since the banquet, Clara felt like she wasn't alone in the house. And for the first time, Leo smiled. The moment struck her in the middle of folding napkins in the prep kitchen, a task she'd taken up to calm her thoughts. Her hands stilled. A flicker, a detail, a request. Hours before the banquet, amidst the chaos of last-minute menu changes and the suffocating tension of a night destined for performance, Sylvia Hale had asked for a private dessert tray. Clara remembered the tone of her voice, too casual to be innocent, too rehearsed to be forgettable. At the time, it hadn't registered as anything more than high-maintenance vanity. Sylvia was always requesting special treatment, almond tuiles on weekdays, figs out of season. But now, in the pit of Clara's stomach, That memory twisted into something darker. The request hadn't come to the kitchen through Donovan. It hadn't even been logged in the formal meal ledger. It had come directly to Clara, through a whispered aside in the corridor, sealed with one of Sylvia's signature glances. That smug, intimate smile women like her wore when they thought they owned the room. Clara had thought little of it then. Now, it sounded like the first click of a trigger. Clara found Marcus outside the surveillance room, where he stood like a marble statue dressed in Kevlar. His eyes barely flicked when she approached. "I need to talk," she said. "Now." He didn't move, didn't invite her in. "You're not cleared to—" "It's about Sylvia," she interrupted. That got his attention. Barely, but enough. Inside the monitoring room, time passed in static whispers and looping footage. Clara explained the dessert tray, her voice steady, her words precise. Marcus listened in that unsettling way of his, head tilted slightly, as if measuring the weight of every syllable. "You're saying she used the tray to get into the kitchen?" he asked. "No, I'm saying she used it as a reason to be near the desserts without raising questions." That Marcus understood. Marcus. He pulled up the feeds from the west corridor outside the prep room, the hours before the banquet. They fast-forwarded. A blur of servers, chefs, blurred faces and time-stamped movements. And then, there she was, Sylvia Hale. Dressed in catering whites, hair tucked under a cap, pushing a silver tray with practiced ease. For a moment, Clara didn't believe it. It was too clean, too bold. But there she was, a Hale playing servant, masked in humility. The betrayal tasted worse than cyanide. She knew the cameras wouldn't be watched in real time, Clara murmured, and no one questioned Sylvia. Ever. Marcus said nothing for a while. Then, she planned it herself. No intermediaries. That's unusual. Clara sat down, feeling the pressure build in her chest. She knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted Leo dead. Saying it aloud felt like swallowing glass. Marcus exhaled through his nose, a rare tell. If that's true, and this footage leaks— He didn't finish the sentence. Clara didn't need him to. She knew what it meant. A scandal, a war, a fracture in the family that could shatter the empire Donovan had spent decades building. But she failed, Clara said, and now she's hiding behind bloodlines. Marcus's eyes hardened. Bloodlines protect until they don't. But this isn't justice you're chasing, it's strategy. You want to live through this, you need more than proof. She blinked. What do you mean? He leaned forward, lowering his voice. You need leverage. You need someone to owe you, and you need to know when not to speak. Clara's mouth went dry. Truth alone wouldn't save her, not in this house, not in this world. Marcus copied the footage onto a private drive, locked it away, and erased the activity log from the system. This doesn't go to Donovan yet, he said. Why not? Clara snapped. She was tired of secrets, of shadows. Because once the Don knows, it's no longer your story. It's his war. Marcus turned to her, his voice cold steel. You want to survive Sylvia Hale, you wait. You observe. Let her believe she's still safe. Clara hated it. The waiting, the silence. But part of her understood. Once Sylvia knew they had proof, she'd become desperate. And desperation made people reckless. What are you suggesting? Clara asked. We watch her, Marcus replied. We let her bury herself deeper, and when the time is right, we pull the ground out from under her. Clara stood in silence, fists clenched at her sides. She hated every word, but she couldn't deny the logic. The poison wasn't just in the souffle, it was in the politics, the silence, the way truth was only useful if it could be weaponized. Justice here wasn't blind, it was patient and calculated. Before leaving, Clara turned back to Marcus. You still don't trust me, do you? She asked. He didn't answer, just gave her a long, unreadable look. Then finally, trust isn't needed. Usefulness is. It wasn't comfort, but in this house, it passed for respect. Clara walked out of the room and into the hallway where Sylvia had once smiled at her like a serpent wearing silk. The memory of the tray, its gleaming handles, its quiet role in an almost murder, stayed with her like a bruise. The trap had been set in polished silver, elegant and cold. Clara had seen it now for what it was, but knowing the truth wasn't enough. As Marcus had warned her, this would not end with truth alone. It would need leverage, and silence, and sacrifice. The air inside Sylvia Hale's private suite felt different the moment Marcus stepped inside. Not in any mystical or symbolic sense, but in the way danger leaves residue like a perfume that never fades. Clara followed a few steps behind him, uncertain if her presence was even permitted, but Marcus hadn't stopped her, and right now, that was permission enough. They tore through the room methodically. Clara watched as Marcus's hands scanned beneath the bed frame, between the pages of antique books, even behind the large gilded mirror. But it was Clara who noticed the strange draft behind the third drawer of Sylvia's vanity, a faint gap that made no structural sense. She pried at it, nails biting into the wood until the panel loosened, and there it was, a slender glass vial, no label, no markings, but unmistakably familiar. Marcus opened it cautiously and they both caught it. That faint, bitter almond scent, so subtle yet so exacting. Cyanide. Her blood chilled. It was real, it was here, and it was hers. Not just the substance, but the intent. Sylvia had planned this. Clara stared at the vial as if it might vanish, like the truth might evaporate now that it was no longer hidden. They didn't summon Sylvia. They waited. She walked into the suite with the grace of a queen returning to court, saw the open drawer, saw Clara holding the vial, and smiled. Not fear, not anger. A smile, slowly, like she was humoring a child. "That's quite the scavenger hunt," Sylvia said, unbothered. "Was there a prize?" Clara didn't respond, her jaw clenched. Marcus remained still, arms folded. "You planted poison to kill a child," he said. Sylvia rolled her eyes. "Don't be dramatic. The boy was never in danger." She crossed the room and poured herself a drink, utterly unfazed. "I was sending a message, a shift in loyalty, a ripple. Families like ours don't change until they bleed." Then she looked at Clara, a slow, venomous gaze. "You think Donovan will exile blood for a kitchen girl?" Her voice was low, intimate, cutting. "He'll say what's needed to preserve peace, then bury you in silence when no one's watching." Clara didn't flinch. She refused to give Sylvia the satisfaction, but her heart cracked, not out of fear, but because deep down part of her believed those words. She wasn't family, she wasn't blood, and in this house blood dictated everything. Hours passed before Donovan arrived. The weight of his presence filled the room like a tide, silent and cold. He didn't acknowledge Clara or Marcus at first. His gaze went straight to Sylvia. She stood tall, composed, almost regal, as if her brother's judgment was beneath her. "Is it true?" he asked simply. No rage, just ice. Sylvia smiled faintly. "Depends what you mean by true." He said nothing, waited. The silence grew heavier. Finally, she sighed. "Yes, I did it. The girl's a liability. Leo's being softened. You're being watched. And if you're too blind to see it, someone has to force your hand." Donovan's jaw tensed, but he didn't erupt. Instead, he turned to Marcus. "You found the vial?" Marcus nodded. "Behind her vanity." His eyes then drifted to Clara, and for the first time they settled. No accusation, just calculation. "Why did you return to the kitchen?" he asked. The question was quiet but carried weight. Clara blinked. "What?" "After you were accused," Donovan clarified, "you still went back. Why?" Her throat tightened. "Because the boy still had to eat." Her voice was soft but firm. She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. Donovan stared at her for a long time. His eyes gave nothing away. Then he turned back to Sylvia, whose composure had finally cracked. "You'd believe her over me?" she asked, her voice sharper now, tight with disbelief. "Over your own blood?" Donovan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You risked Leo's life," he said, like a judge delivering sentence. "You're no longer welcome in my house." Sylvia's mouth fell open, but the moment shattered before she could protest. The guards had already stepped forward, having heard enough. She turned to Donovan in a final plea, but he didn't look at her again. Her heels clicked against the marble as they escorted her away, dignity folding into silence. Clara didn't move. She couldn't believe it was over, that the woman who had nearly killed a child with a smile on her lips was really being removed, not protected, not buried behind family name and wealth. The vial still rested in Marcus's hand, a glass ghost of what could have been. Clara exhaled slowly. The verdict had come, and it had gone in her favor, just for now. As the guards disappeared down the hall with Sylvia in their grip, Donovan remained still, watching the space she had just occupied. No fury, no relief, just silence. Clara stood near the doorway, unsure if she was supposed to leave or speak or simply exist. Then he turned to her again, that same unreadable stare. "You could have let it happen," he said. "You had every reason not to care." Clara straightened. "I cared." Another beat of silence. He nodded once, curtly, then left the room without another word. Marcus stayed behind, watching Clara like she was a question still unanswered. The truth was out. The poison had a name. The threat had a face. But clarity, Clara realized, wasn't freedom. It was a new kind of burden. The Don had exiled his sister, yes, but the house still wasn't hers. Not yet. Not truly. And even now she felt the words echoing in her mind. This would not end with truth alone. It would need leverage and silence and sacrifice. That night, the Morelli estate seemed to settle into an uneasy stillness, like a great beast folding its limbs after a long prowl. But Clara Bennett knew better than to mistake silence for safety. The chaos had passed, the accusation lifted, the real culprit removed, but peace had never been part of the deal. Not here. She sat on the edge of the guest bed with her suitcase open, half-packed, her folded uniform shirt placed with mechanical care. One sleeve hung loose, and she left it that way, as if unsure whether to smooth it out or let it wrinkle into memory. The events of the past days clung to her like powdered sugar on skin. The moment she smelled the almonds, the cold of the freezer, the soft edge of Leo's voice. Now, even with Sylvia gone, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something else had shifted beneath the surface. That survival in this house came not from proving innocence, but from proving usefulness. And maybe, just maybe, she had done both. Still, she packed. That was how she survived before. She never overstayed where she wasn't claimed. The knock at her door was sharp but not aggressive. Not a summons, not a threat, just a statement of presence. Clara rose, expecting Marcus or another guard with protocol in hand. But when she opened the door, it was Donovan. Not the man seated at the head of a table, surrounded by men who killed with their pinky rings. Not the Don, just a father. In a pressed shirt, rolled at the sleeves, his expression unreadable but softer around the edges. She froze. "May I come in?" he asked. No command, no assumption. She stepped aside. He walked in slowly, not out of hesitation, but as if unsure what shape this moment should take. She didn't offer him a seat. He didn't need one. He stood by the window, hands behind his back. "I hear you've been packing," he said. She nodded. "Didn't think I should assume anything." A beat passed. "You're right," he said almost to himself, "but I didn't come to correct that. I came to ask you something." Clara's heart thudded, a slow rise of tension under her skin, the way it used to when she'd wait outside courtroom doors or on hospital benches. Donovan turned toward her fully now. No riddles, no veiled warnings. "Do you want to leave?" he asked, plain and simple. And then, after a pause, "Or stay, or—" She looked at him, unsure whether it was a test or an offering. His voice didn't waver, though it lowered slightly. "Not as staff," he clarified, "but as something more." The words caught her off guard. For all she had prepared, defenses sharpened, past concealed, loyalties guarded, she hadn't braced for this. "More," she repeated, not quite believing him. "More what? What does that mean in a house like this?" He didn't answer right away. He simply walked to the open suitcase, adjusted the fallen sleeve, and then looked at her. "It means you wouldn't have to keep proving you belong here." Clara's breath stilled in her chest. She had spent her life trying to belong somewhere, anywhere. Kitchens, shelters, courthouses, rehab programs. She'd belonged to everyone and no one, for sale in hours and judged by seconds. And here, in this twisted place of money and blood and loyalty bought in quiet acts of violence, someone was offering her more than a paycheck. Not because she'd begged, but because she'd been brave when it counted. She didn't answer Donovan immediately. She moved instead to the window, the same one she'd looked out of for the last few days, when fear and suspicion caged her like a wild thing under watch. And there, in the garden below, she saw Leo, alone. Kneeling on the grass, arms extended, guiding the fragile arc of his model airplane through the air with the intensity only children and madmen possessed. The same boy who had said, "You didn't look scared." The boy who hadn't asked to be born into any of this. The boy she'd almost lost, and who had almost lost her. She turned back to Donovan, her eyes glassy but her spine straight. "If I stay," she said slowly, "it's not because I want protection. It's because he needs someone who sees him, someone who's not afraid to cry when he nearly dies." Donovan nodded once, curtly, his jaw flexing with something unspoken. He didn't offer sentiment, only truth. "Then stay," he said, "not because I command it, but because he already chose you." That broke something in her, not pain, not fear, but the iron cage she'd welded around hope, finally rusting. He left without ceremony, closing the door softly behind him. Clara stood for a long time, hands trembling at her sides. She didn't unpack yet, but she no longer needed to. For the first time since her arrival, she allowed herself to breathe without waiting for the world to snap back. She sat on the bed, not to collapse, but to rest, like someone who might actually sleep through the night. Hope, fragile and frightening, crept into her limbs. She had been accused, cornered, nearly destroyed, and still someone had seen her, not as a chef, not as a problem, but as something more. The suitcase remained open, but for the first time Clara didn't reach for it. She looked back to the window where Leo's plane flew a little higher with each try, and she let herself imagine staying. Spring crept into Boston like a long-awaited truce, not announced with fanfare, but felt in the small shifts of daily life, warmth in the breath, light in the hours, and a calm in the rhythm of mornings. Inside the Morelli estate kitchen, Clara tied her apron with deliberate fingers, her hands slower now, not from hesitation, but reverence. The fabric was the same sturdy linen worn by every chef before her, but this one bore her name, Clara Bennett, stitched not in company white, but in deep garnet thread, the color of chosen things. It wasn't just a uniform anymore. It was proof she hadn't just survived this house. She had been accepted by it, claimed by it. Somewhere behind her, pots simmered, spices opened, and dough rose, but Clara no longer chased perfection out of fear. She cooked because it brought something back to her, a sense of purpose she hadn't believed she'd find again after New Orleans, after juvie, after the night Leo almost died. She exhaled, tied the final knot, and turned to the day like it was hers to shape. Leo burst into the kitchen without warning, a blur of energy and flower prints, cheeks pink, eyes lit. He was wearing the apron she'd made for him out of an old tablecloth, the words "co-chef" drawn in crooked letters across the front. "You're late for your taste test," he declared, slamming a spoon onto the counter with mock authority. Clara arched an eyebrow. "Is that how you speak to your superior?" He grinned. "You're only superior because you cheat with chocolate." She scoffed and flicked a bit of icing at his nose. He shrieked, laughing, and she caught a glimpse of something that undid her, not just his joy, but his freedom. The kind of lightness a child shouldn't have had to fight for, and yet he had, with more grace than she had at his age. He darted past her again, dipping a finger into the mixing bowl before she could stop him. She swatted his hand, half-hearted. "Leo Morelli, I swear to God." "You already swore this morning," he teased. "Twice." She tried to glare, failed, laughed instead. From the hallway, Donovan stood watching, half-shadowed by the doorway. He didn't enter, he didn't speak. He simply observed, the way a man watches something he never knew he wanted until he nearly lost it. His arms were crossed, but his face, once carved from stone, had softened in imperceptible ways. A furrow gone, a jaw unclenched. He didn't smile, not exactly, but something in him released. Trust, he was learning, was not earned in grand gestures or brutal loyalty. It was built in glances across kitchen counters, in a child's sudden laughter, in the way Clara moved now. Not as someone bracing for impact, but as someone choosing to stay. There was no more talk of exile, no more questions about pasts that couldn't be rewritten. Only the present, one baked good at a time, threading them into a family that never would have happened if not for a single scent in the air that night. Later that afternoon, when the kitchen had quieted and Leo had vanished on one of his mysterious missions, Clara found herself alone by the coat rack. She reached into her pocket for her phone and felt something else. A small, folded piece of paper, slightly crumpled. Her brows furrowed as she pulled it out. Unfolding it slowly, she found not words, but a drawing. A stick figure plane with wide wings, a round chocolate cake with candles, and 3 figures drawn in colored pencil, one tall with a tie, one small with wild hair, and one with long eyelashes and an apron. All 3 held hands. Below them, written in shaky letters, were the words, "Us." Clara pressed the drawing to her chest, eyes wet before she even felt them sting. It wasn't poetry, it wasn't proof, but it was real. It was Leo's way of saying what he couldn't always say out loud. "You matter. You're mine." That evening, Clara returned to the kitchen, the drawing tucked safely into the side pocket of her apron. Leo reappeared soon after, as if on cue, his shoes untied, his hair full of static from whatever new project he'd been tangled in. He looked at her, suddenly quiet. "Are you staying for good?" he asked, voice small, like he was afraid to hear anything but yes. She didn't answer right away. She walked to him, brushing the icing smudge from his chin with her thumb. Then she nodded. No speeches, no conditions, just the truth, clean and final. Leo stared at her, eyes shining. She expected him to cheer or hug her or run off again. Instead, he whispered, "Good," and turned back to his paper airplane on the table, as if the world had been set right. And Clara, apron dusted in flour, heart full of things she'd never thought she'd feel again, wiped away a tear with the back of her hand and got back to work. She would stay, not because she was asked to, but because somewhere between the poison tray and the paper plane, this house had become a home. We poured our hearts into bringing this story to life. Every scene, every line was crafted with care, thinking of you. If this story moved you even a little, help us continue sharing moments like this by subscribing to our channel. It's the best way to support what we do and allows us to keep creating meaningful stories just for you. Take a moment to explore the other videos we've prepared. Each one holds something special. And if you felt something while watching, we'd love to hear it in the comments. Your words mean the world to us. Thank you for being here with us.